May 30th, 1989, a forest outside of Hanover, West Germany. A couple police officers arrive to investigate reports about an abandoned car on a remote road. As the officers scan the forest around it, they stumble upon something horrifying. A pile of bones in the middle of a few feet of charred ground. Human bones. Somebody burned a body here. It was done carefully to avoid a forest fire in the middle of a heat wave, but still thoroughly enough to get rid of any identifying information. The bones belonged to a man named Karl Koch. At the time of his death, he was 23 years old, worked as a driver, had a severe drug addiction, and suffered from serious mental issues. Karl Koch also had an alter ego. He was known as Hagbard, a hacker who conducted the very first cyber espionage operation in history. Along with a small group of friends, he broke into hundreds of computers belonging to major defense contractors, factories, institutions, research organizations, and laboratories all across the world. He stole thousands of cutting-edge scientific documents, from reports about missile trials to microchip schematics to nuclear research data. But here's the catch. Karl and his friends were tracked down. To do that, the authorities had to pretty much invent the modern field of cyber forensics. After a few years and some luck, both the FBI and the German police had the hackers under surveillance. Not willing to spend the rest of his days on the run, Karl approached the police and confessed. He was questioned and put under witness protection. 2 months later, his remains were found in a forest near Hanover. Believe it or not, that's only a minuscule part of the first known case of international cyber espionage. Hold on tight, because the deeper you go, the wilder things get. And to begin with, we have to talk about Operation Showerhead. Let's go back a few years. 1986, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in California. This is the nerve center for the American scientific community. The internet as we know it did not exist yet. Instead, there was this bunch of tangled networks that universities and other research institutions used to share data and resources. And Berkeley had some of the best computing power this side of the Pacific. Physicists, chemists, astronomers, and the like from all across the US would hook up to the lab through one or another network to crunch numbers whenever needed. Mind you, this level of compute was not cheap, so the laboratory would charge its users for each second. The records were kept tight. And one day, the staff noticed a slight error. Somebody used the computers but did not pay for 9 seconds of their time, 75 cents. I'm sure it's nothing serious compared to the time the undergrads probably wasted using those supercomputers to play Pong or whatever, right? The staff put one of its junior workers on the task of figuring out the discrepancy. The worker's name was Cliff Stoll. He was an astronomer who found himself out of a job and took up computer maintenance as a temporary gig. 75 cents? They must be joking, right? Here's a laboratory full of equipment worth millions upon millions of dollars, and they have Cliff chasing 75 cents? He was overqualified, that's for sure, and he found the issue in no time. A user didn't fill out his billing address. A user named Hunter. Curious, but, well, they had the culprit. Problem solved. Hunter got booted out of the system, and that's the end of that. But the next day, another user began causing problems. An account belonging to a well-established professor tried breaking into a closed-off network. Coincidentally, the professor was out on sabbatical. Weird. Cliff could just kick him out like he did Hunter, but something told him not to. He began tracking the account. And by tracking, I mean Cliff connected printers to every telephone line going into the building so that he'd have a printout of all the activity throughout the night. Yeah, he used dozens of printers as an endpoint detection device. That's some ingenuity. When the morning came, the printouts horrified Cliff. The account of the professor was stolen. That's a no-brainer. But more than that. The account had taken control of the entire laboratory network. The hacker who snatched the account conducted what would nowadays be called privilege escalation. He used a weird vulnerability. A specially crafted email forced the central server to make the hacker a super user, the main administrator of the whole network. If that looks like an enormous security oversight to you, you're not alone. This story was checked by one of our researchers here at Cybernews, and he could not believe his eyes. But believe it or not, it is true. Back in the 80s, cybersecurity just wasn't a thing, and emailing administrator privileges looked like a neat idea. Thanks to stories like these, we now know that it was very naive and very dangerous. And if you want to hear more of them, please subscribe to our channel, because as long as enough of you do that, we won't have to put sponsored segments into our videos. No, this isn't extortion. Not at all. Anyway, back to the story. As it turned out, that privilege escalation wasn't the first time for the hacker. He'd already done that before with other aliases too. Hunter, Jaeger, Benson, Hedges. It turned out that for this hacker, breaking into Berkeley was a routine, because he didn't just use the lab for its computing power. No, he did something a lot grander. You've probably heard about ARPANET, the prototype of the modern internet. It was one of the networks Berkeley was connected to, and by far the largest. Every scientific institution that mattered was connected to ARPANET. Through it, scientists would conduct calculations on Berkeley's computers, share their findings, cooperate on research, and do other important things. Because who would steal their super secret research from a specialized computer network, right? Somebody was stealing the research, all of it. The hacker Hunter was using a whole Swiss Army knife of vulnerabilities to infect hundreds of computers across the United States. He basically took over ARPANET. But that was not enough for Hunter. From ARPANET, he hopped onto Milnet, and the theft of scientific data suddenly began looking like child's play. Milnet was a section of ARPANET used by the military. In 1983, they separated the two networks so that Professor Einstein over there couldn't just accidentally connect to a nuclear silo by punching in an incorrect code. But the networks weren't completely separate. There were computers you could use to jump between them. And that's exactly what Hunter did. Now, not everything was as bad as it seemed. You couldn't use Milnet to launch missiles or give orders to nuclear bombers, or whatever else the paranoid media from the 80s imagined.
This program has access to every computer system in the country, and it thinks for itself.
But even so, it was still a bit of a problem. When Cliff discovered Hunter hopping off to Milnet, he contacted the military, sometimes going as far as calling the actual bases the hacker was exploring at the moment. And their response was, "Why should we listen to you? The really sensitive stuff is secure anyway. If something could be hacked, it's probably not that important." Some grueling weeks later, Cliff managed to convince the FBI to take him seriously and investigate the intrusions. But they had no resources to catch the hacker. Cliff would have to do that himself. No pressure. It took quite a bit of time, but eventually Cliff figured it out. He did that by mapping Hunter's activities on ARPANET and then tracing him backwards to his hiding spot. The hacker used Berkeley as one of his bases of operations, and to connect to it, he used TimeNet, another huge computer network. Cliff followed the TimeNet connection to some major telecom providers and right across the Atlantic to West Germany. Turns out, Hunter had another base of operations at the University of Bremen, but nobody noticed the accounting errors there. And he got into Bremen through a local phone line using a modem. Yeah, this guy was good. Very good. Here's the thing. Remember those TV shows from the 90s where they tried to trace the location of a phone call, and to do that, they had to stay on the line with the caller for minutes on end, otherwise the trace would be lost? Well, that's actually how it worked. And the reason for that was this. The phone networks were electromechanical. Technicians had to use voltmeters to measure hundreds of relays to find out which one you were connected through. The tech was rudimentary, and they would have to do the same to trace Cliff's hacker, except it would take hours. But Cliff did not have hours, because Hunter usually connected to Berkeley for just several seconds at a time, and then hopped off to somewhere else. Cliff would have to convince him to stay on the line for as long as possible. But how? Well, the man wasn't a professional programmer, but he did have lots of creativity, and he was not afraid to use it. So he launched Operation Showerhead. Yes, just in case you're curious, he did come up with it in the shower, and it still makes more sense than most government naming conventions. Those modem connections were slow at the time, really slow. Downloading a text document could take hours, and Cliff knew that Hunter was specifically after documents, secret documents. He gobbled up anything connected to missiles, lasers, any sci-fi sounding thing he could find. So, Cliff created his own documents about missiles and lasers. Through the weekend, he conjured up an entire library of fake paperwork about the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Project Star Wars. It was Reagan's super advanced missile defense effort that was the talk of the town back in the day. Cliff's documents were just a pile of bureaucratic gibberish with every scientific mumbo-jumbo buzzword he could muster. He typed out a pile of these documents, uploaded them to Berkeley's computers, and just like that, a technique known as the cyber honeypot was invented. Cybersecurity professionals use it to this day, and it's essential for modern law enforcement. Most of the hacker arrests you see in the news are made thanks to honeypots. But in the 80s, that was just not a thing yet, and Cliff was the one who came up with the idea. while standing in his shower. And the hacker, he took the bait. He saw a strategic defense initiative in the title and began pumping the documents through his bleeping and chirping modem, one excruciating line at a time. The German telephone technicians grabbed their voltmeters and went to town on those relays, and several hours later, the police had the address where Hunter lived. And that's where most retellings of this story usually end. Hunter turns out to be a team of German teenagers. They get arrested. German police find out they worked for the KGB and were selling the stolen documents to the Soviets for huge sums of money. Ende. But that's just the first half of the story. Because as Cliff was tracing his hacker, another even bigger drama was unfolding out there in Germany. A drama chock full of hacking, drugs, and rock and roll. That drama later became known as Project Equalizer. Welcome to Chaos Computer Club. To this day, it's the largest association of hackers in Europe. Basically, if you merge Anonymous with the Pirate Party, then multiply it by the DEF CON conference and put it in Europe, you get the Chaos Computer Club. In the early 80s, this organization tried to unite all hackers, or computer freaks as they were known at the time. It also preached the ideas of open sourcing, freedom of information, and sticking it to the man. All of that with the anarchist bent of people who survived purely on the light of CRT monitors, underground techno music, the smell of soldering, and whatever substance they might have been distributing under the table. Chaos Computer Club. No word in that name was taken lightly. Chapters of the club popped up all across Germany, spreading their cyberpunk message. In 1985, such a chapter opened in Hanover. Well, a chapter's a big name for what was just a couple guys in a local bar. Those guys were named Dob and Hagbard. Dob, real name Dirk Otto Brzezinski, was a brilliant programmer in his late 20s. Extremely, if not obscenely well paid, he had a day job freelancing for some of Germany's finest tech companies, a gray suit, a well-lit office, and a life that bored him to no end. Hagbard was the polar opposite. His real name was Karl Koch, and he grew up in an abusive family which left quite an imprint on him. Both of his parents died of cancer and left a substantial inheritance. Hagbard did his best to waste that on computers, drugs, and partying. Soon, several more people joined this small club. Hans Heinrich Hubner, nicknamed Pango, was a hacker cowboy from Berlin. When the local computer freaking scene turned out to be too boring for him, he sought friends elsewhere and ended up in Hanover. Marcus Hess, nicknamed Ukmel, was a physics student who got into computers by moonlighting for a local startup and got absolutely bewitched by them. There was also Peter Karl, Pedro, who had nothing to do with hacking, but he was their drug dealer and just liked to hang around smart people. These guys were some of the best programmers in the country, but there's no doubt who was the soul of the gang. It was Hagbard. Everyone described him as almost a prophet, a genius who radiated the spirit of the age. Unlike the others, he had no background in programming. He was completely self-taught and preferred brute force above anything else. There are legends about him almost supernaturally guessing passwords and smelling vulnerabilities. If the first attempt at hacking didn't work, Hagbard would try again, and again, and again, spending days by the computer and consuming a crazy amount of whatever mind-bending cocktail Pedro supplied. There was one more thing about Hagbard. He was obsessed with a book. This one, the Illuminatus Trilogy. A sort of main character of this book is named Hagbard Celine. That's the inspiration for Karl's handle. In the book, Hagbard is a reclusive hero who travels the world in a golden submarine with a crew of outcasts and a supercomputer of his own design. Hagbard's life has one purpose: fighting the Illuminati. The history of the world is the history of the warfare between secret societies. This is an epigraph that opens up the book, and it sums the thing up perfectly. The setup is simple. The world is controlled by a conspiracy, an evil cabal that runs humanity as material for their dark experiments. They worship devils, play with governments, and seek to bring about the apocalypse. Only heroes like Hagbard can foil their plans. They fight the Illuminati and manage to beat them at their own game. The Illuminatus book was extremely important to Karl. He named himself after the protagonist and his computer, after the one in the book, and he took its teachings extremely seriously. He was absolutely sure the world was run by the Illuminati, and by gosh, he would dedicate his life to fighting them. The book's philosophy also worked well with the ideas of Chaos Computer Club. They were anarchists, digital punks fighting against whatever authority there was, for freedom for all. The club, Hagbard, and his friends agreed Information can't belong to governments or corporations. It should belong to everybody. And if some people have difficulty accessing it, that access has to be provided by any means necessary. Basically, they created the philosophy of modern computer pirates. But there was a huge challenge for this philosophy. The internet, in its modern form, did not exist back in the mid-'80s. People from all across the world could not just use their personal devices to find whatever they want, no matter how good they were at hacking. The Soviet Union was the perfect illustration of this. It was behind the Iron Curtain and didn't have access to Western technologies. Although it tried to create a sort of unified computer network, that ended up in failure. And compared to the US and Europe, the number of personal computers in the USSR was minuscule. Whatever computers the Soviets had were either smuggled in from the West or a decade behind the curve. Hagbard and his friends weren't communists, not at all. In fact, the Illuminatus books described communism as just another project of the Illuminati, along with rock and roll and recreational drug use. But helping the people of communist countries, even if done through the government, was another matter entirely. So the group decided to become digital Robin Hoods. By that time, they formed a well-oiled hacking machine that could breach almost any system, powered by the technical talents of the 3 brilliant programmers, fueled by Pedro's drugs, and inspired by Hagbard's preachings. Lo and behold, they launched Project Equalizer. But they still faced one question. How do you actually go about helping the Soviets from West Germany? At first, Pedro, the one with the people skills, just went to the Soviet embassy and offered the group services. That did not work. Then Hagbard tried his luck. To prove his worth, he threw together a demo of sorts. A bunch of carefully researched information about American computer networks, the pathways the hackers could access, and the systems they were capable of breaking into. There were passwords that opened up access to Milnet, the Pentagon, NASA. But to keep the Soviets hooked, Hagbard decided to hide them. To get those passwords, the KGB would have to pay 1 million German marks, and not a penny less. You see, the money Hagbard inherited from his parents had long since been squandered. The earnings of programmers were huge by the standards of the day, but their appetites for drugs and tech were larger. The guys were broke, and while their vigilante ambitions ran wild, they needed money fast. Hagbard and his friends traveled to East Berlin and approached a KGB officer. His name was Sergei, and he was a KGB officer. As you can guess, convincing him to trust a bunch of young, drugged-up hackers was not easy. And on top of that, he had difficulty grasping how a computer network even worked, let alone understanding what hacking meant. Also, 1 million marks? This kind of money was just out of the question. Hagbard's plan to give the Soviets the military passwords didn't work. He had to settle for less. So on their next trips to East Berlin, the hackers brought whatever important-sounding data they could find. Nuclear research, information on missile tests, scientific papers on physics and astronomy. Later, they began transferring programs, industrial software, operating systems, even malware. The hackers would burn that on magnetic tape and bring it to Sergei. He would give the tape to his technicians for checking, and if the information appeared to be worthwhile to them, the hackers would get paid. At home, they would use a modem connection at Hagbard's dingy old apartment, siphon the information through the phone line that was as slow as it was unreliable. They would use TimeNet to connect to the University of Bremen, then hop across the Atlantic and through some more steps and land at Berkeley. Nothing could stop them. Nothing but the KGB. Because after a few trips east, the scientific papers no longer cut it. Passwords to the Pentagon would have been nice, but for those, Hagbard demanded 1 million marks. They had to find a compromise, and Sergei gave a hint. The KGB would be extremely grateful if the hackers could provide anything on the Strategic Defense Initiative, the infamous Star Wars project. This was the time when Cliff Stoll discovered Hunter on Berkeley's network, and in truth, that was a bit of a happy coincidence. Project Equalizer was in peril. The tightly knit group of hackers began falling apart. Some of the guys were wary of the spy games they got dragged into, others had qualms about doing it for the money, and everybody got sick of Hagbard's Illuminati obsession. You see, here's the thing about this book. From all we know, Hagbard, Karl, saw it as an adventure novel based on some true facts. Well, it certainly looked like that, with its references to documents and real-world events. But in reality, it was a parody of conspiracy theories, Cold War paranoia, and everything in between. The authors worked in the press and kept receiving these letters where people would write about worldwide secret societies, Freemasons, flying saucers, communist agents, satanic cults, and the Illuminati. Well, it was basically Twitter before Twitter existed. The book was written on one premise. What if all these nuts are right, and every single conspiracy theory they complain about really exists? But if the eventual appearance of the internet proved any one thing, it's that any parody, no matter how extreme, can be taken for a real thing. And that's how Hagbard took it. As we now know, he had serious mental issues and obsessive drug use that pumped that up. This is not to diminish Hagbard's skill as a hacker. By all accounts, he was a genius, but he was a deeply disturbed individual, and there was a price to pay for his talents. The team began fracturing. They no longer cooperated, got sloppy, and stopped cleaning up their tracks. They began leaving accounting errors in the systems they used. At the same time Cliff found their traces at Berkeley, the guys were also discovered by the engineers of CERN, and possibly by some of the other victims. Sensing the impending doom, Hagbard threw one last Hail Mary. He found some new documents on the Strategic Defense Initiative on Berkeley systems. Just what the Soviets wanted, right? You can imagine what happened later. Soon after falling into the Star Wars honeypot, Hagbard noticed something frightening. He was being tracked. The German police were onto him, and there was no way to escape. He decided to give up, and in a few days he contacted the authorities and told them everything about Project Equalizer. And that was the real end of the world's first cyber espionage operation. Hagbard got into witness protection, his friends were arrested, and Project Equalizer, along with Operation Showerhead, became history. What happened next is hard to discuss. A week later, Hagbard's charred bones were found in a forest near Hanover. An official investigation was launched and concluded Karl Koch had taken his own life by self-immolation. Yes, the circumstances of his death look incredibly fishy, and we can doubt the official conclusion as much as we want. But Karl's friends? For some reason, they don't doubt it. According to them, before the end, Karl got disillusioned with everything. His plot to help the Soviets did not work. His war on the Illuminati appeared to be pointless, and the same government he tried to fight was now protecting him from the KGB.
Halt aus seiner psychischen Situation nicht rausgekommen ist und daran dann eben auch gescheitert ist. Also egal wie es jetzt im Endeffekt abgelaufen ist, aber es war seine seelische Instabilität, die ihn letztlich ins Irrenhaus gebracht hat, die ihn in eine psychiatrische Behandlung gebracht hat und die ihn wahrscheinlich dann auch das Leben gekostet hat.
Fast forward a couple decades, and some of the people involved with Project Equalizer became famous hackers and security researchers in their own right. None of them were as famous as Cliff Stoll, though, the man who caught them. Between a best-selling book, countless lectures, and a documentary with glorious live reenactments,
someone named Sventek.
Sventek?
He became a legend. Karl Koch, Hagbard, also became a legend. He got a bittersweet techno song dedicated to him, and a German film with painfully 90s hacking scenes. But what immortalized all of these people more than anything was the techniques they created. Project Equalizer was truly the first international cyber espionage operation in the world, and Operation Showerhead laid the groundwork for every counter-espionage effort that came after. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, check out some other hacking history videos we have, like the one about Project Gunman. It explains how the Soviets spied on American embassies back in the 80s, or our other explainer about how the modern Russian hacking scene works. That's it, thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.